This week I'm tackling another shirt dress. I think these are the perfect staple for summer. And I have some more fabric from the Tammy Handmade and Minerva collab that I really want to put to use. This one is another organic cotton poplin like last week. For this one, I was thinking of doing the Rosalie Shirtdress from moo.com. This is like a really super classic, like short sleeve shirt dress, you know, with the classic collar, with the tie or belt to cinch it around the waist. I just think it'll be really cute for spring and summer. I've never actually tried this pattern, but I feel like it has the potential to be a staple in my wardrobe. So I'm really excited to try it out. And I have learned from last week, I'm gonna peruse the instructions, but probably just gonna follow my own construction ideas. I'm gonna figure out by myself without their help because their help was not helpful last week. I need to finish putting the pattern together, but then we can get started with the sewing.
Putting PDF patterns together is a little time consuming, but it's actually pretty simple. You basically have little corner markers on every corner of every page and you have to match them up. It's really just like a big puzzle. You can trim around the whole page before matching them up, but you can also just clip the corners like this so you can see the markers and call it a day. So you join the pages to form rows, and then when all of the rows are assembled, you attach them to each other. I find it easier to match the rows if I trim the whole extra paper off the bottom or top of each of them. When you have the whole pattern put together, you can cut it out like you would any other pattern. The next day, I started cutting everything out of the fabric. I like to start with the big pieces, and just like last week, this print is not directional, so I can flip pieces over to get the most out of the fabric. I don't usually cut into the fabric until I have all of the pieces pinned to it and can be sure that I have enough to make the garment, but I thought it wasn't a really big risk here. The smaller pieces always take longer, especially because there was quite a few that I needed to cut 4 out of or 2 on the fold. When I have all the pieces cut out, I started transferring any markings I might need, cutting notches, and pinning anything I can together. First, I pinned the center seams of both layers of the belt. I also pinned the sleeves closed with right sides together. Next, I transferred the darts onto the front pieces. This is my favorite method. I poke a hole at the dart tip on the paper pattern, and then I transfer that, as well as where each line ends on the side, and then I connect it with a ruler. And of course, I pin my darts flat. also pinned a pocket to each side front with right sides together, matching the notches. There's no darts on the back piece, so I just added a pocket to each side. Next, I cut out the interfacing for the collar and collar stand. You can interface both layers if you want, or you're working with a super flimsy fabric, but I prefer to only interface one side. I've used my interfacing with probably too much heat, but I'm impatient. With that done, I pinned the collar pieces to each other along the outer edges with right sides together. Now I can sew all those seams on my sewing machine. The seam allowance for the collar pieces is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, and for everything else, it's 1/2 inch, which is around 1.3 centimeters. I trimmed the excess seam allowance on the belt seams, and I'll just press them since they'll be encased in the belt and don't really need any more finishing. I did the same for the collar, trimming the corners and the excess seam allowance and flipping it right side out, making sure to get the points nice and crisp with the help of my point turner before pressing the collar flat. For the darts, I tie off the long thread tails I left at the tips a few times before I trim the thread to about 1 inch or 2 centimeters, and then I press the darts down with the help of my tailor's ham. I also press the pockets here. First I press the seam allowance towards the pocket, and then I flip the pocket to the inside and press it again. I probably should have done this bit first, but then I finished the raw edge of the pocket that I just stitched. Basically, I run just that bit of the dress through the serger since everything else will be finished when I stitch the side seams. Speaking of which, the next thing I did was pin the fronts to the back with right sides together along the shoulders and sides, matching the notches and pinning around the pockets too. Here I also pinned the 2 layers of the belt to each other with right sides together, making sure I'm matching the center seam. To pin the collar, you want to match the interfaced collar stand to the interfaced collar and vice versa. I usually pin the collar to one of the respective collar stands, and then I flip it over and pin the other collar stand with right sides together, sandwiching the collar. Then I stitch all of those seams on the machine. When sewing the collar stands, I like to leave the seam allowance on the bottom edge free just to make life easier later. And when sewing the belt, make sure you're leaving a gap so you can flip it right side out when you're done. Oh, and also when sewing the sides of the dress, I backstitched around the pocket openings to make sure that those seams are really strong. Now I can trim the seam allowances of the collar stands, flip it out, and press. I also trimmed the seam allowances on the belt and start the super duper fun task of flipping it right side out before pressing it flat too. And before I moved on, I also finished the edges of the dress and the pockets over on the serger before pressing them all. Next up, I pinned each button placket to a front opening edge with right sides together, matching the notches. I stitched those seams on the machine and pressed. First, I pressed the seam allowances and plackets away from the dress, then I press in the seam allowance on the remaining long edge of the placket, and finally, I press the whole placket in half. Then I pinned the interfaced layer of the collar stand to the neckline of the dress, matching the center of the collar stand to the center back of the dress. When I get to the plackets, I want the center fold of the plackets to be the edge, so I fold the rest over the collar to the outside, and I flip it over once it's sewn in. I hope that makes sense. It's really hard to explain. After I stitched the collar to the dress, I also top stitched all around the belt. This serves as a way to close that gap we left and also adds a little decoration. Plus, I feel like if you top stitch stuff like this, it always stays flat way easier and longer with wear. To finish the cuffs on the sleeves, I pressed them in along the marked line on the pattern, which I believe is 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters, and then I pressed in the raw edge about 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters. After I had all of that pressed, I top stitched along the folded raw edge first and added a second row of top stitching along the lower edge of the cuff, just because I thought it would look cute. With everything sewn for now, I trimmed the excess seam allowance on the neckline, clipping the seam allowance next to the plackets so that it can be pressed up into the collar along with the rest of the neckline. I started day 3 with some hand sewing. I'm tacking the folded edge of the remaining side of the collar stand down, making sure the stitching is hidden. Then I added the gathering stitches to the sleeve caps to help me fit them into the armhole, which is exactly what I did next. I like to start by matching the side seam of the dress or top to the underarm seam of the sleeve, as well as the notches. Then I use the gathering stitches to either ease the sleeve into place or more often to pull all of the ease over into the shoulder and add a little shoulder flare to the sleeves. Next, I stitched the sleeves in place and try not to stab myself with pins. Honestly, this is simultaneously my favorite and least favorite seam to do because the seam itself is super annoying and fiddly, but it also means I'm so close to finishing my project and I love fun sleeves so much, so it's really like a love-hate scenario for me. Anywho, once the sleeves are in, I serge the raw edges and press the seam allowance towards the sleeve with the help of my tailor's ham. To get started on the hem of the dress, I flip the front plackets to the outside along the center fold line and stitch them down along the seam allowance. When I flip them back to the outside, it will turn the rest of the hem up as well, which is exactly what we want. I measured this with my seam gauge to make sure I keep the rest of the hem even, but when I checked it against the other side, it didn't match. So I hung up the dress on my dress form and I realized I hadn't got the seam allowance correctly on the plackets. I marked the difference on the longer one, stitched it again along the new line, and now when I flipped it back to the outside, the hem allowance matched perfectly on both sides. With that cleared up, I used my seam gauge to pin up the hem evenly all along the dress. Then, just like I did with the cuffs on the sleeves, I folded in the raw edge and pinned that down all along the dress too. And again, just like I did with the sleeve cuffs, I top stitched along the folded raw edge first and then the bottom edge as well. With the hem done, I stitched the plackets down along both edges too, making sure I'm catching the folded edge on the inner side. While I did that, I realized I hadn't added any top stitching to the collar. It's totally optional, obviously, but I feel like it would match the vibe, so I top stitched along the outer edges of the collar and all around the collar stand too. At long last, it was time to select my buttons from the stash, So I picked these kind of transparent, super simple shirt buttons because I felt like the other fun ones that I had kind of got lost in the print. Then I used the buttons to mark the size of buttonhole I will be needing and mark that along the right opening edge of the dress. Honestly, you can do whatever side you want. Typically, men's clothes have the buttonholes on the left side and women's clothes have them on the right. But it's such a weird thing to be gendered, in my opinion. It really does not matter at all in terms of construction or anything like that. So do what works for you. My buttonholes turned out to be about 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch, and I kept them 8 centimeters or 3 inches apart. Anyway, I made the buttonholes on my machine with the buttonhole foot, and I like to start with the bottom one just to test out the water, see if the opening is the right size for my buttons, and if everything is working well before I start on the rest of them. When I've made all of the buttonholes, I line up the front opening edges and use the buttonholes as a template for my button placements. I could have sewn these buttons on the sewing machine because they have 2 holes, but my machine needs to be cleaned and oiled, so it was really starting to act up, and I decided it would just be faster to sew them by hand on this occasion. I'm using doubled up thread, so it goes by a little quicker too. Doubled up thread means I insert a length of thread on the needle and then tie the 2 ends together, so when you're sewing, you effectively are using 2 strands of thread instead of 1. You could do 2 physical strands like you might do with embroidery, but since I'm using sewing thread and that comes in single strands, I just find this is easier to do. Anyway, with my buttons all sewn down, it's time for the reveal.
Alrighty, wrap up time. I'm really pleased with it. It turned out really, really cute. It's like very simple, but yeah, it's super cute and super wearable. I wouldn't normally want to style it with a turtleneck underneath because I don't really like wearing short sleeves over long sleeves, but the weather did a 180 on me and it's now cold and windy and a little bit rainy. And I'm a firm believer against suffering for fashion, so this is what we get today. But yeah, I don't think there were any like construction issues. It's a really simple pattern to put together. Yeah, I honestly have no notes. Like this is what I wrote down in my sewing journal, is just like I have no notes. I like the belt. I think it definitely needs the belt to kind of give it a little bit of shape. But when I was getting dressed, before I put on the belt, it was giving a bit like maternity scrubs, something you'd wear at a hospital, but like a fancy hospital, you know? But when I put the belt on, I think it like brings the outfit together. You don't have to make the belt if you don't want to, or if you don't have enough fabric. You could just wear a different, like an accent belt, or you know, something like a different kind of belt, I guess. I'm really pleased with it, and I highly recommend you to give this a try. If you like shirt dresses, especially in spring and summer, I think this is definitely a very good one to try. And I guess even if you like shirt dresses but you don't want it to be short sleeved, you could add a basic long sleeve to this, alter it that way, and make it a bit more of a year-round staple if you wanted to. It's just a little idea. If you stayed this long and you haven't already, you should really consider subscribing to my channel. I post most Fridays, and I try to make content about sewing and knitting and crocheting, and sometimes I like to do all of these things but with a nerdy kind of cosplay twist. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, definitely stick around. You can also consider following me on Instagram and TikTok. I post on there pretty regularly as well, so go and follow me on there if you want to. That is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye.